The tires of Alex's old Honda hummed softly, blending in with the rustle of autumn leaves blowing down the highway. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, and there was an October chill in the air, the kind that makes you want to keep the windows open but makes you want to close them. Alex Harper, a 20-year-old medical student, sat relaxed behind the wheel, one hand on the steering wheel, the other tapping out a rhythm on his knee. His dark hair was tousled by the wind, and his green eyes kept glancing at his best friend, Mark Blake, who was slumped in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone with a grin that promised trouble. "So, are you going to tell me about your mysterious lady?" Alex teased, his voice a mixture of curiosity and mockery. He had spent the last 30 kilometers trying to get Mark to tell him about the crazy night at the club that he had mentioned. Mark was usually not shy about sharing his adventures, but now he was surprisingly evasive. Mark chuckled, not looking up from the screen. "Come on, Harper, you're so crazy. I told you, one night, nothing special." "Nothing. Then why are you grinning like you've hit the jackpot?" Alex narrowed his eyes, glancing at his friend. Mark's blonde hair was styled with deliberate casualness. His blue eyes sparkled with that self-confident charisma that made him the star of any party. Mark was the kind of guy who walked into a room and all eyes were on him. Alex, calmer and more focused, had befriended him in his first year precisely because of this difference. They complemented each other. Mark finally put his phone away, stretched, and his leather jacket creaked. "Okay, you talked me into it. Her name was Kay, okay? Met her at Pulse a couple of weeks ago. Not like the local students. She has some kind of, I don't know, aura, like she knows what she wants." Alex snorted, shifting gears on a straight stretch of road. "Aura? Are you a poet now or something? Come on, spit it out. What does it look like? Did you hook up or something?" Mark's grin widened, but there was something in his eyes that was either doubt or tension. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled cocktail napkin with a smudged phone number. "Let's just say she's a hottie. Older, like 30-something. Dark hair, a killer smile. And yeah, we slept together. That's all you can get out of her, Harper. Let's keep her a mystery." Alex laughed, shaking his head. "The older woman, huh? A dream came true. Was she the one who gave you the napkin? It looks like a trophy." Mark twirled the napkin in his fingers, then shoved it back into his pocket, his smile fading slightly. "Yeah, sort of. Hey, what's up with this family dinner thing? Your mom's cooking, so I'm expecting a feast. Is she still making that lasagna?" Caught yourself being interested? Pin it with a like and a subscription so you don't get lost. A comment with a location is a bonus to karma. "Of course," Alex replied, his voice warming. "Mom's been texting all week that she's cooking like crazy. Dad's going to be late, as usual, buried in his plans. But it's going to be great at home. He hasn't been out in a while." Mark nodded, looking out the window at the passing trees, their leaves glowing red and gold. "You have a picture postcard family, man. Lucky you." Alex shrugged, but he couldn't hide the pride in his voice. "They're fine. Mom, it's true, has been clinging to me since I left for medical school, but that's out of love. Dad, well, he's Dad. A workaholic, but reliable. You'll see for yourself." The conversation turned to school exams, late-night cramming sessions, a professor who seemed determined to fail Alex. But Mark's story about Kay stuck in his head like a splinter. Mark usually spilled the beans, so why was he being coy now? Alex shook the thought away as they passed the sign for their town, the familiar name sending a wave of nostalgia through him. Home was close, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. The road took a turn, and Alex clicked on the radio. An old rock song filled the cabin. Mark picked up the tune, loud and off-key, and Alex couldn't help but join in, their voices shouting over the roar of the engine. For a moment, everything was simple two friends, no worries, the road ahead. Alex didn't know it would be the last easy moment for a long time. They pulled into the Harper neighborhood as dusk fell and the houses lit up with lanterns on their porches. The Harper house was a picture-perfect two-story white house with black shutters. Alex parked in the driveway, the gravel crunching under his tires. He pulled his bag out of the back seat, tossing Mark his backpack. "Ready for the Harper family show?" Alex asked, grinning. Mark slung his backpack over his shoulder, returning his confident smile. "Always ready, bro. Just don't let your mom grill me about my grades." Alex chuckled as he walked toward the door. The air smelled of fireplace smoke and roasting garlic, and he could already picture his mother in the kitchen, wearing an apron, bustling around the stove. He knocked once, pushed the door open, and called, "Mom, we're home." The warmth of the house enveloped him, the wooden floors, the photographs on the walls, the quiet ticking of the old grandfather clock in the living room. Alex dropped his bag by the stairs, feeling the stress of school recede. Mark followed him in, looking around the house with curiosity and a hint of mockery, as if he were in a museum. "It smells amazing," Mark said, sniffing. "Your mom is a genius." "Yeah, Alex began, but his mother's voice interrupted him. "Alex!" Karen Harper burst out of the kitchen, her dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, her face glowing. She was 43, but she looked younger, and her brown eyes were warm as she threw her arms around him. "God, I've missed you." Alex hugged her back, laughing. "I miss you too, Mom. Easy, you'll choke me." Karen pulled away, slapping his arm, and turned to Mark. "And you're Mark, then. Alex always talks about you. Welcome." Mark turned on his best charm, but his smile was a little forced, as if he was studying her. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I hear you cook like a chef." "Call me Karen." She waved her hand. "Come on, boys. You're probably starving. Dinner's almost ready, but Dad's running late, as usual." Alex caught the slight edge in her tone when she mentioned their father, but he didn't pay it much mind. His mother was always nagging him if his father stayed late at work. He led Mark into the living room, where they collapsed on the couch while the television quietly droned on the news. "This is it," Alex said, gesturing around the room. "Home, sweet home." Mark nodded, looking around at the photos, the clock, the neat stack of magazines on the table. "Yeah, man. Cozy. You're lucky." Alex grinned, leaning back. "Don't relax. Mom will start asking about your plans for life before dessert." Mark laughed, but his hand slipped into his pocket, his fingers brushing the napkin. The smile faltered for a moment, but Alex didn't notice. He was too busy soaking up home. Karen Harper stood at the kitchen island, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of her apron as she sliced tomatoes for a salad. Outside, the evening light was fading, and the bare branches of the chestnut tree cast shadows across the lawn like long, bony fingers. In the living room, the grandfather clock ticked, an old gift from David's parents, its monotonous rhythm the backdrop to her life for 20 years. It seemed louder today, as if it were counting down not the seconds but her own patience. She glanced at the table, where candles and a bottle of red wine were already set out for the dinner that would fix everything. That would give back some of what she and David had lost. "Karen, where are you?" David's voice came from the office, sharp as it always was when he was absorbed in his work. She clutched the knife, feeling irritation rise in her chest. "In the kitchen," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Dinner's almost ready. Will you come?" David appeared in the doorway, his shirt undone at the top, his dark hair slightly disheveled. At 46, he was still handsome, broad shoulders, hard eyes, but there was only weariness in his eyes now, and something else Karen had learned to recognize over the years of marriage: distance. "Listen, I can't," he said, not even looking at her, leafing through some drawings on his tablet. "The client is pressuring me. I need to finish the project by morning. I'll eat later." Karen froze, the knife hovering over the cutting board. She felt the words catch in her throat, but she managed to force them out. "David, I've been cooking all day. This was our night. You promised." He finally looked up, but there was no warmth in his eyes, only irritation. "Karen, don't start. You know how important this is. If I don't deliver the project, We'll lose the contract. It's for all of us, damn it. For us? Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. When was the last time you did something for us? For me, you didn't even notice that I tried. She trailed off, not wanting to voice how desperately she had tried to bring them back together. Last summer, when Alex had gone off to medical school, she had suggested they go away for the weekend, but David had waved her off. Not now, I'm too busy. On their anniversary last year, he had flown off on a business trip, leaving her with a bottle of wine and an empty house. David sighed, rubbing his temples. Karen, I'm not in the mood for this. You know I'm trying. For the family, for Alex. Don't be dramatic. Don't be dramatic. She threw the knife down on the board, and the blade clanked against the wood. I'm not dramatic, David. I'm invisible. You only see your work, your plans. And me? Do I even exist for you? He stared at her as if her words had been a blow, but quickly composed himself. You want me to drop everything and sit with you at dinner while we lose clients. That's not how it works. I provide for us. That's my job. And my job is to keep this house so you can hide in it. Karen felt the tears stinging her eyes, but she held them back. I'm not asking for much, David. Just be here, at least sometimes. David shook his head, already turning away. We'll talk later. I have work to do. He walked into the office, and the door clicked behind him, like a period in their conversation. Karen was alone, her hands shaking as she shoveled the sliced tomatoes into a bowl. The clock ticked, its sound mocking her efforts. She looked at the table, the candles, the wine, the white tablecloth, and wanted to laugh at her own foolishness. Had she thought that one evening could fix everything? That David would suddenly see her, as he had 20 years ago, when they were young and Alex had not yet been born. Now she felt like a ghost in her own house, a shadow no one noticed. The phone on the table vibrated, and Karen jumped. The screen lit up with a name, Lisa. She wiped her hands on her apron and answered, trying to sound calm. Hi, Lisa. Karen, finally. The voice of Lisa, a young colleague from the office, was as cheerful as always, almost impudent. What, did you bury yourself in the kitchen again? Listen, I know you're going to visit your genius son tomorrow. Let's get out somewhere, okay? While Alex is busy, we'll give you a shake-up. Karen forced herself to smile, though Lisa couldn't see it. Lisa, I'm not in the mood. I've had a rough day. Oh, come on. Lisa didn't let up. You're always in this perfect house of yours, like a museum. It's time to live, Karen. Remember how we danced at the office party last year? You were a star. Let's go to Pulse. It's a club not far from campus. It's fun, the music is awesome, and no one will ask how old you are. The neon sign for the Pulse Club blinked above the entrance, casting purple and blue lights across the wet pavement. The music was booming even outside, the bass pounding in Karen's chest as she stood in the doorway, fiddling with the strap of her purse. Her black dress, which she hadn't worn in a decade, clung to her figure, making her feel both bold and ridiculous. Lisa, her co-worker, was already tugging at her hand, laughing at her hesitation. The evening was warm for October, but Karen still huddled in her light cardigan, as if it would protect her from her own doubts. Karen, come on, don't hold back. Lisa, in skinny jeans and a sparkly top, looked like the embodiment of the youth that Karen so desperately needed. Her blonde hair bounced as she pushed her way toward the doors, ignoring the line. You look amazing, trust me. You're not a mom or a wife today. You're just Kay, rock star, today. Kay? Karen raised an eyebrow, but Lisa just winked. Yeah, Kay. Sounds cool, and best of all, no one will guess you're Mrs. Harper. Relax, let's have fun. Karen forced herself to smile, even though her insides were clenching. She had come to campus to visit Alex, but he had been busy with his lab until late in the evening. Lisa, having learned that Karen was in town, had insisted on getting her out of mom mode. After the argument with David the previous day, when he had once again chosen work over her, Karen had felt taut. Lisa was right. She needed to get away, at least for a few hours. But now, standing in front of the club, she wasn't sure that was a good idea. Come on, Kay. Lisa pulled her past the bouncer, who nodded lazily, letting them inside. Inside, Pulse was a chaos of light and sound. Lasers cut through the air, bouncing off the mirrored walls, and the crowd on the dance floor moved as one organism to the electro beat. Karen felt her heart pulsate to the beat, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. Lisa ordered drinks at the bar, shoving something bright pink and an umbrella into Karen's hand. Here's to you, rock star. Lisa raised her glass, clinking it with Karen's. Drink, and no more I don't drink sweets. Karen rolled her eyes, but took a sip. The drink was sweet but warm, and she felt the tension in her shoulders ease a little. Lisa was already pulling her onto the dance floor, where students and locals were mingling in the crowd, their faces blurred by the neon light. Karen's movements were unsteady, but the music was infectious, and after a few minutes she found herself laughing, succumbing to the rhythm. Now that's what I call it, Lisa shouted, twirling around. See, you can still rock. Karen smiled, her hair disheveled, her dress hiked up just above her knees. She could feel the eyes on her, not the ones she was used to at Tom meetings or the office, but hungry, younger ones. It was like a breath of air after so long a dive. She wasn't invisible. Not here, not now. Look who's coming, Lisa nudged her, nodding at a guy who was making his way through the crowd. Tall, with tousled blonde hair and a leather jacket, he looked like a walking challenge. His smile was cocky, but there was a genuine interest in his eyes. This is Mark, Lisa said as the boy came closer. He's kind of a local star. Mark, this is Kay, my friend. Show her how to have fun at Pulse. Kay, huh? Mark extended his hand. His voice was low, with a slight hoarseness. Nice to meet you. Lisa wasn't lying. You're clearly not from around here. Karen shook his hand, her fingers trembling at his warm touch. Are you the resident fun expert? She asked, trying to sound confident. Lisa giggled and disappeared into the crowd, leaving them alone. You could say that, Mark grinned, leaning in closer to shout over the music. But you, Kay, look like a man who knows what he wants. Dance. Karen hesitated, but Lisa, who had appeared in the crowd, winked at her, and she nodded. Okay, one dance. One dance turned into three. Mark moved easily, his hand occasionally brushing her waist, and each time it was like an electric shock. He was younger 20, maybe a little older, but his confidence and easy flirtation made Karen feel less like her 43-year-old mother and more like someone else. Someone she hadn't been in a long time. They talked over the music, about the club, about the music, about how he hated his lectures. Karen didn't mention her husband or her son or her life. She was just Kay, and that was liberating. Another cocktail? Mark nodded toward the bar, and Karen, already feeling a little dizzy, agreed. They sat at the counter, and he ordered something stronger. What are we drinking, Kay? For, she faltered, looking into his blue eyes, which looked at her as if she were the only one in the room. For a night that will never be repeated. Oh, I like that. He clinked glasses with her, and they drank. The alcohol burned her throat, but it gave her courage. The conversation became easier, the laughter louder. Karen didn't notice Lisa disappear into the crowd, leaving her with Mark. You don't look like the type who hangs out at Pulse, Mark said, leaning closer. His breath smelled of whiskey. What brings you here? Karen shrugged, smiling. I just wanted to remember what it was like to be alive. He looked at her for a second, then smiled, slowly, almost dangerously. You know, Kay, you're alive. Very much so. She felt her cheeks heat up and took a sip of her drink to hide her embarrassment. The music changed to a slow track and Mark stood up, holding out his hand. Another one? Karen nodded, and they returned to the dance floor. His hands were bolder now, hers too. She closed her eyes, letting the music and the warmth of his body carry her away. It was crazy, she knew. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a shadow. When he suggested they leave, she didn't think. She didn't think about David, Alex, or her home. She just said, let's go. They left the club, the air cool, but her skin burning. Mark called a cab, and 10 minutes later, they were at a motel on the outskirts of town, cheap but clean, with a neon sign flashing outside. She woke up first in the morning, her head throbbing with cocktails and shame. Mark was asleep, his face soft, almost boyish. She dressed quietly, feeling reality creep back in, like that damn clock ticking in her head. There was a cocktail napkin on the table, and without knowing why, she wrote, "This is a mistake. Be quiet." She slipped it into his jacket pocket, hoping he'd understand. When Mark woke up, he smiled and reached out to her, but she was already at the door. "Kay, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice hoarse from sleep. "It won't happen again," she said, without looking at him. "Don't write, don't call." He shrugged, but a shadow of disappointment flickered in his eyes. Karen Harper stood at the stove, stirring lasagna sauce, the aroma of tomatoes and basil filling the kitchen, mingling with the smell of garlic bread toasting in the oven. The windows were steamy, the October evening darkening outside, and the grandfather clock in the living room ticked as it always did, but today its rhythm seemed too loud, almost threatening. She adjusted her apron, her hands moving automatically, but inside she felt a knot of anxiety. Alex had arrived home with a friend, Mark, and in a few minutes they would sit down to dinner. Mark. She had heard the name from Alex on the phone yesterday, when he had said he was driving a friend. She hadn't paid attention to it then, but now that she knew who he was, the floor beneath her feet was slipping. 2 weeks ago, she was Kay, a woman who danced at a club, laughed, drank cocktails, and allowed herself to forget who she was. 2 weeks ago, she spent the night with Mark, a young man whose face now appeared in her mind with alarming clarity. She hadn't known he was her son's friend. She hadn't known until she'd opened the door an hour ago and seen him standing next to Alex, wearing the same cheeky grin he'd worn at the Pulse. Her heart had skipped a beat, but she'd forced herself to smile, to hug Alex, to greet Mark as if he were just a guest, as if that night had never happened. "Mom, it smells amazing." Alex's voice came from the living room, where he and Mark were sitting on the couch. Karen winced, almost dropping her spoon. "It'll be ready soon," she responded, trying to keep her voice even. "5 minutes, boys." She turned to the sink, turning on the water to drown out her thoughts. Her fingers shook as she washed her hands, and she glanced at the second phone, hidden in the drawer with the kitchen towels. The one with a text from Mark, "You were alive." She hadn't deleted it, even though she knew she should. It was her secret, her weakness, and now it stood in her living room, chatting with her son. "Karen, where are you?" David's voice, sharp as ever, broke her from her thoughts. He walked into the kitchen, still in his work shirt, holding a clipboard. His dark hair was disheveled and his face was tired, as if he hadn't slept in a week. "I'm late. The client is redoing everything again." "You're always late," Karen said, not looking at him, and immediately regretted her tone. She didn't want to start a fight, not today, when her nerves were already on edge. David frowned but didn't answer, just set the tablet down on the table. "Is that Alex and his friend over there? What's his name, Mark?" "Yes, Mark." Karen turned back to the stove, her heart pounding. She couldn't let David see her tension. "He seems like a good guy. Alex has told me a lot about him." "Hum," David nodded, already scrolling through something on the screen. "I hope he's not the type to talk all night. I have a meeting in the morning." Karen gritted her teeth, stirring the sauce. His indifference, his constant absorption in his work, it was what had driven her to Pulse 2 weeks ago. But she couldn't think about it now. She had to control herself, be the perfect wife, mother, housewife. She pulled the lasagna out of the oven, its golden crust perfect, but Karen barely noticed. Her thoughts were on Mark. Would he recognize her? Would he say something? She remembered his smile at the club, his hands, his voice, and the napkin she'd slipped into his pocket. "This is a mistake. Shut up." "Mom, can we eat yet?" Alex walked into the kitchen, his dark hair as wild as his father's, but his eyes were warm. He was her boy, her pride, and the thought of him finding out made her stomach clench. "Almost," she said, forcing a smile. "Go get Mark. And, Dad, if he looks up from his tablet." Alex chuckled, glancing at David. Dad, come on, put your work down. Mom tried. David looked up, slightly irritated. I'm coming, Alex. Don't start. Karen turned away so no one would see the tension in her face. She pulled out the garlic bread and began slicing it, trying to concentrate on the movement of the knife. But when Mark followed Alex into the kitchen, her fingers trembled and she almost cut herself. Karen, Mark said, his voice calm but a hint of recognition in his eyes. It looks amazing. Thanks for the invite. She met his gaze for just a second, and it was enough to make her heart pound. He knew. He knew exactly who she was. But his smile was the same cheeky, slightly mocking, like that night. Karen forced herself to nod. I'm glad you're here, Mark. I hope you like it. Oh, I'm sure, he said, and there was something in his tone that made her skin crawl. She couldn't tell if he was mocking her or just playing the part. But Alex didn't notice, already grabbing a piece of bread from the table. Mom, you've outdone yourself, he said, chewing. Mark, get ready. This is the best thing you've ever tasted. No doubt, Mark sat down at the table, his gaze sliding over Karen, but quickly returning to Alex. Your mom's a legend, dude. Karen turned back to the sink, her hands shaking again. She turned on the water, pretending to wash dishes to buy herself time. Her thoughts were racing. He wouldn't tell. Not here, not now. But what if he did? What if Alex found out? Or worse, David. She glanced at her husband, who had finally put down his tablet and sat at his desk. But his expression was distant, as if he was still mentally in his office. Karen, sit down already, David said, his voice more tired than warm. Stop fussing. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron, and sat down across from Mark. Her eyes met his involuntarily, and for a moment she saw the same spark she had seen at the club, defiant, inviting. She looked away immediately, focusing on her plate. The clock was ticking, its sound like a metronome of her fear, counting down the seconds before everything could fall apart. So, Mark, tell me how things are at uni, David asked, helping himself to lasagna. Alex says you're the life of the party. Mark chuckled, but Karen sensed a slight tension in his shoulders. Yeah, I try not to get bored. But, studying isn't my thing. I'm more into life. In life, then, David chuckled, but without judgment. That's good. At your age, you have to try everything. Karen nearly choked on her wine. She put the glass down, trying not to look at Mark. Alex, oblivious, was chattering about his labs, about how his anatomy professor had flunked everyone. But Karen was barely listening. Her thoughts were that night in the neon, in the music, in his hands, and in the napkin she left behind, begging him to keep quiet. She prayed he would keep his word. Mom, why are you so quiet? Alex's voice pulled her back. He looked at her with a slight smile, but concern flashed in his eyes. I'm just tired, she said, forcing a smile. Been cooking all day. Eat it before it gets cold. Alex nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual. Karen felt her heart tighten. He couldn't suspect anything. No one could. She picked up her fork, but the food tasted bland. The clock ticked, and each tick was a reminder. Her secret was too close to being revealed. Alex Harper leaned back in his chair, breathing in the scent of lasagna that filled the dining room. The candles on the table cast a warm glow on the white tablecloth, and outside, night had finally settled over the suburbs, turning the windows into dark mirrors. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked, its rhythm familiar, almost comforting, but tonight there was something off about the air. Alex couldn't quite put his finger on it, but his intuition, honed over years of observing patients in practice, told him that something was wrong. He glanced at his mother, who sat across from him, her fingers nervously clutching her wine glass. Mark, his best friend, sat next to him, his usual chatty self subdued by an odd reserve. Even his dad, David, seemed even more distant than usual, his head buried in his plate, as if lasagna would solve all his work problems. So, Mark, David began, cutting off a piece of bread, tell me what you do at uni besides partying. Alex says you're the star of the campus. Mark chuckled, but his smile was strained, not the one that usually lit up his face. He cleared his throat, pushing his plate away. Yeah, studying a little, hanging out a little, living, basically. Alex narrowed his eyes on his friend. Mark was a master of the chatterbox, usually babbling about his adventures until everyone burst out laughing. But now he was reserved. Alex noticed his fingers fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth, as if he didn't know what to do with his hands. Dude, why are you so modest? He teased, trying to lighten the mood. Tell me about that night at the Pulse. You were blabbering about some K-girl last night, and now you're keeping quiet. Mark froze, his fork clanking against his plate. He glanced up quickly, and Alex caught a flash of something panic in his blue eyes. Oh, nothing special, Mark shrugged, but his voice was a little higher than usual. It's just the night, Alex. Don't start. Across from her, Karin suddenly coughed, and her glass almost fell over. She caught it at the last second, but a drop of wine splashed onto the tablecloth, leaving a dark stain like blood on white. Oh, how clumsy, she muttered, grabbing a napkin and rubbing at the stain. Her movements were too abrupt, almost panicked. Mom, come on, it's just a tablecloth, Alex said, but his gaze lingered on her. She had been strangely quiet all evening, unlike herself. Usually, she peppered him with questions about medical school, joked with the guests, but today her smile was strained, like a mask. Everything okay, Karin? David asked, looking up from his food for the first time that evening. His tone was more annoyed than concerned, as if her awkwardness was interfering with his thoughts about work. Yeah, just tired, Karin replied, not looking up. Been cooking all day. Alex frowned. Tired? His mother never complained about cooking. She loved these family dinners. He remembered her calling him during the week, excitedly telling him about the menu. But now her hands were shaking as she handed Mark the salad bowl. Their fingers almost touched, and Mark jerked his hand away, spilling more wine, this time on his shirt. Damn, Mark muttered, grabbing a napkin. I'm out of business today, I guess. Yeah, you're just like me in anatomy class, Alex joked, but his laugh was forced. He watched Mark wipe away the stain and saw him sneak a glance at Karin. It was a brief glance, but there was something odd about it, like they were sharing a secret. Karin stood up, too abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I'll get some more water, she said, almost running toward the kitchen. Her movements were as nervous as a patient's before a bad diagnosis, and Alex felt a twinge of anxiety. Mom, sit down, I'll do it myself, he said, but she had already disappeared behind the door. He looked at Mark, who was now concentrating on picking at his lasagna, avoiding his gaze. Dude, why are you so nervous? It's just dinner, not an exam. Mark chuckled, but it was fake. Everything's fine, I just didn't get enough sleep. School, you know. Studying? Alex raised an eyebrow. You said lectures weren't your thing. Relax, everyone here is one of us. Yep, ours, Mark nodded, but his fingers reached for the edge of the tablecloth again. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. David, oblivious, continued eating, his fork scraping against his plate. Alex, how are your labs going? He asked, clearly trying to fill the silence. Have you failed anatomy yet? Alex rolled his eyes, but was glad for the change of topic. Trying not to fail. Our teacher is a sadist, but I'm coping. What about you? Still building skyscrapers? I'm trying, David chuckled, but his gaze slid back to the phone lying next to him. The client is redoing everything again. If I don't deliver the project tomorrow, it'll be fun. Karen returned with a carafe of water, her face a little paler than usual. She set the carafe on the table, avoiding Mark's gaze. Eat up, boys, she said, her voice too high. I don't want it to get cold. Alex looked at her, trying to figure out what was wrong. She was always the life of the dinner, making jokes and telling stories, but today she was tense. He remembered how she had acted on the phone yesterday, nervous but happy. And now? Now she looked like she was hiding something. He glanced at Mark, who was now chewing intently, but his eyes kept glancing at Karen. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" Alex asked, unable to contain himself. "You're somehow different." Karen froze, her hand tightening on her fork. "It's okay, Alex," she said, and her smile was so artificial he almost winced. "I've just been busy. Please eat." "Yes, eat, son," David added, his tone sharp. "Don't pester your mother. She's on her feet all day anyway." Alex frowned but said nothing. He didn't want to fight, not on his first night home. But something was wrong. He could feel it, the way he could feel it when a patient hid his symptoms. His gaze darted back to Mark, who was now staring at his plate as if all the wisdom in the world was there. What the hell? Mark was always the life of the party, and now he was acting like he'd been caught stealing. "Mark, are you going to tell me about this Kay or not?" Alex asked, deciding to tease his friend to lighten the mood. "Yesterday, you were chattering about how she drove you crazy. Come on, don't be shy." Mark choked, his fork clunking again, and he grabbed his glass of water to cover his awkwardness. "Come on, man, I told you, it's nothing," he muttered, but his cheeks were slightly flushed. "Just a night, that's all." Karin suddenly dropped her spoon, and it clattered to the floor. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, bending down to pick it up. Her hands were shaking, and she nearly knocked over the decanter. Alex looked at her, his concern growing. It wasn't just tired. It was more than that. "Mom, let me," he said, standing up, but she waved her hand. "Sit down, it's okay." Her voice was almost sharp. She picked up the spoon, but didn't sit back down, instead going back into the kitchen, muttering something about dessert. Alex glanced at Mark, who was now avoiding his gaze, focusing on his plate. David, as always, was in his own world, scrolling through his phone. The clock ticked, filling the silence, and Alex felt a strange feeling growing in his chest. Something was wrong. Not just wrong. He didn't know what, but his gut was screaming that this dinner wasn't going to end with just dessert. Mark Blake leaned against the porch railing, smoking a cigarette, the cold night air stinging his lungs and mixing with the bitter smoke. Behind him, the Harper house glowed with warm windows, but inside, Mark felt like he was cornered. Dinner had been a disaster, not the overt, screaming, broken plate kind, but the quiet, under-the-skin kind, where every look from Karin was like a knife, every word from Alex like a step through a minefield. He blew out smoke, looking up at the stars that barely made it through the dim light of the streetlights. His fingers fiddled with a crumpled cocktail napkin in his jacket pocket, the one on which Karin, or Kay, as he knew her, had written, "This is a mistake. Be quiet." He wouldn't have been quiet if he'd known she was his best friend's mother. The door creaked and Mark flinched, almost dropping his cigarette. Alex came out onto the porch, his dark hair disheveled, his green eyes glittering in the dim light like a cat stalking its prey. He looked not just tired, but wary, as if something was gnawing at him from the inside. "What are you doing here?" Alex asked, crossing his arms. His voice was even, but Mark knew that tone. It was what Alex used when he suspected he was being lied to. "Dinner wasn't even over, and you ran off like you were forced to cram anatomy." Mark chuckled, trying to regain his usual bravado. "It was just stuffy in there, needed some air." He took a drag on his cigarette, blowing the smoke out to the side so as not to get it in Alex's face. But his heart was pounding, just like it had been at dinner, when he'd seen Karin and realized who she was. Alex leaned against the railing next to him, looking out at the dark lawn. "You've been weird all night, man. What's wrong with you? Is it that K thing of yours? You're twitching like you're taking an exam." Mark felt his throat tighten. He wanted to laugh it off, like he always did, but the word K hit him like a slap. He glanced at Alex, trying to figure out how close he was to the truth. Dinner had been torture. Karen dropping her spoons and avoiding his eyes, her shaking hands, her forced smile. He knew she recognized him, and he recognized her not Kay, but Mrs. Harper, his friend's mother. How could he have been such an idiot? That night at the Pulse had been just a night hot, drunk, no strings attached. But now she was a bomb, ready to blow everything up. Nothing, Mark said, trying to sound casual. Just didn't get enough sleep, and your mom's cooking is so bad it almost makes me explode. He forced a smile, but Alex wasn't buying it. Oh, come on, Alex narrowed his eyes, his voice sharpening. You've been on edge all evening. And Mom, she's not like that either. It's like you two know each other. What the hell, Mark? Mark took a drag on his cigarette, buying time. His fingers tightened on the napkin in his pocket, and he felt sweat break out on his palms. He could lie, brush it off, like he had done hundreds of times. But Alex was not the kind of person to be fooled. They had been friends for 2 years, sharing pizza at 3 in the morning, cramming for exams, laughing at dumb jokes. Mark knew that Alex sensed a lie the way a doctor senses a bad pulse. And yet he tried. Dude, what's wrong? He said, trying to laugh. This is my first time at your house. Your mom's just hospitable, and well, maybe I had too much wine. Alex stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Don't lie to me, Mark. I can see it. You were looking at her like, I don't know, like you were afraid of her, and she was looking at you the same way. What's going on? Mark turned away, looking down the street where the neighbor's dog was barking at a passing car. He could have avoided the question, made a joke of it, but something in Alex's voice, the mix of anger and pain, broke him. He stubbed his cigarette out on the railing, leaving a black mark, and exhaled. Okay, Alex, you want the truth? I screwed up. Big time. Alex tensed, his hands clenched into fists. What do you mean, screwed up? Speak up. Mark pulled the napkin out of his pocket, crumpled and smudged with Karin's handwriting. He held it like a grenade about to explode. That night at the Pulse I told you about. The girl, Kay, that was your mother, Alex, Karin. I slept with your mom, friend. The silence fell like a blow. Alex looked at him, his face frozen, his eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe it. What did you say? His voice was quiet, but there was a threat in it, like before a storm. Mark swallowed, his throat dry. I didn't know, man. I swear. She was at a club with some friend named Kay. We were dancing, drinking, then, went to a motel. I didn't know she was your mom. She didn't tell me she was married, that she had a son. I just realized today when I saw her. Alex stepped forward, his face pale and his fists shaking. You're lying, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. You slept with my mom? Are you serious? I'm not lying. Mark held up his hands in surrender. I swear, Alex, I didn't know. It was one night, drunk, stupid. She left me this note. He held out a napkin that read, It's a mistake. Shut up. I thought she was just some woman. I didn't know she was. Your mom. Alex snatched the napkin, his fingers squeezing it so hard the paper cracked. He stared at the handwriting, and Mark watched his face change, from disbelief to anger to something worse, pain. You slept with my mother, he repeated, as if tasting the words. And you sat at our table, eating her food like nothing happened. Alex, Mark tried to find the words, but they were eluding him. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. I'm sorry, man. Excuse me? Alex stepped closer, his voice growing louder. You slept with my mom, Mark. What the hell did you think? That this was okay? That you could just barge into my family like that? Mark stepped back, his back against the railing. I didn't interfere. I didn't know who she was. It was just a night, Alex. One night. She wanted it. Don't you dare talk about her like that. Alex grabbed him by the jacket, his face inches from Mark's. Do you even realize what you've done? This is my family, Mark, my mother. Mark didn't resist, his arms hanging at his sides. He saw the pain in his friend's eyes and hated himself for it. I know, he said quietly. I screwed up. But I didn't know, I swear. Alex let go of him, throwing him so hard that Mark hit the railing. He threw a napkin on the floor, where it fell into a puddle of light from the lantern, proof of his betrayal. You're not my friend anymore, Alex said, his voice shaking. "Get out of my house." "Alex, wait." Mark took a step after him, but Alex had already turned, walking toward the door. "I didn't mean this." The door slammed, leaving Mark alone on the porch. He picked up the napkin, his fingers shaking as he stuffed it back into his pocket. He felt like his life had just shattered, like glass under a hammer. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He had destroyed something he couldn't get back. The sun was shining through the curtains, casting golden streaks across Alex's bedroom floor, but the morning brought no relief. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, where an old crack like lightning reminded him of the stories he'd told her as a child. Now the crack seemed a symbol of what was going on in his head, a rift he couldn't heal. He'd been wide awake that night, Mark's words still stinging. "Kay is your mother, Karen." Alex clenched his fists, feeling the anger and pain warring inside him like two beasts tearing him apart. He didn't know what was worse, Mark's betrayal or the thought that his mother, could do this. The ticking of the grandfather clock came from the living room, its rhythm mocking his attempts to compose himself. He stood, rubbing his face, and went to the window. The yard was empty, except for the neighbor's cat, lazily wandering the lawn. Mark was probably still asleep in the guest room downstairs if he'd stayed on the porch at all after their argument. Alex didn't want to see him, but he knew he had to. He wanted the truth, the whole truth, not just the bits and pieces Mark had spilled during the night. He walked down to the kitchen, barefoot so as not to wake anyone. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock, its sound louder than usual, as if counting down to the inevitable. There was a bowl of leftover salad on the table, the tablecloth still stained with the wine Mark had spilled. Alex froze, remembering last night's dinner. His mother's shaking hands, her forced smile, the way she dropped her spoon, and that phone she'd hidden in the drawer. He took a step toward the closet, his heart pounding, but stopped. Not now. If he took it, he wouldn't be able to pretend he didn't know. "Good morning," Karen's voice startled him. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, wearing a sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but she smiled as if nothing was wrong. "Want some coffee? I just made some." "Yeah," Alex muttered, sitting down at the table. He watched her take out the mugs, her movements too careful, as if she was afraid of doing something wrong. "Has Dad left yet?" "Same as always," Karen replied, her voice even, but Alex caught a hint of bitterness. "He has an early meeting, said he'd be back for lunch." Alex nodded, but his thoughts weren't about his dad. He was looking at her, trying to find traces of the woman Mark had talked about, Kay, who danced at the club, drank cocktails, gone to a motel with him. It didn't fit with the image of his mom baking pies and scolding him for wearing dirty sneakers. But last night's dinner, her nervousness, the way she looked at Mark, everything pointed to the fact that Mark wasn't lying. "Is Mark still asleep?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed the tension. Karen froze, her hand holding the coffee pot shaking slightly. "I guess," she said, not looking at him. "I haven't checked. He's in the guest room, right?" "Yeah," Alex took a sip of coffee, burning his tongue, but he didn't even wince. He watched her fuss over the stove, getting out a frying pan, as if she wanted to keep her hands busy. Her movements were as nervous as yesterday, and he noticed her glance quickly at the towel drawer where she'd hidden her phone. "You were kind of, I don't know, strange yesterday," he said, watching her reaction. "Is everything okay?" Karen turned to him, her smile too quick, too forced. "Of course, Alex. I'm just tired. You know how nervous I am when you come over. I want everything to be perfect." "Perfect," he repeated, his voice almost sarcastic. He wanted to ask directly, to tell her everything Mark had said, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he said, "Mark was weird too, like you two knew each other." Her face went pale, but she quickly turned away, lighting the stove. "Acquaintance?" Her laugh was strained. "He's your friend, Alex. I was just trying to be hospitable. Would you like some eggs?" "No, I'm not hungry," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. She avoided his eyes, which only made him more suspicious. He remembered how she hid her phone, how her hand shook during dinner. Mark had told the truth, but how fat was she? What else was Mom hiding? Footsteps sounded from below, and Mark walked into the kitchen, his blonde hair tousled and his face rumpled, as if he hadn't slept either. "Morning," he muttered, avoiding Karen's gaze. "Got any coffee?" Karen nodded, her movements becoming even more abrupt. "Sure, I'll pour you one now." She reached for the mug, but her hand caught the decanter of water, causing it to almost fall. She caught it at the last moment, but Alex noticed her cheeks turning red. "Careful, Mrs. Karen," Mark said, his voice too polite, almost mocking. He sat down at the table, across from Alex, but his eyes flickered to the drawer of towels before he looked down. Alex felt his anger flare up again. He wanted to punch Mark, right there, for his insolence, for daring to sit at their table after everything. But he held back, gripping his mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You're up early," he said, his tone cold. "I thought you'd leave after yesterday." Mark shrugged, but his smile was weak. "I decided to stay. You said to yourself that I was a guest." Karen set the mug down in front of Mark, her hand shaking, and coffee spilled onto the table. "Oh, sorry," she muttered, grabbing a rag. She began to wipe the stain, her movements almost panicked, as if she were trying to wipe away something bigger than the coffee. "It's okay," Mark said, but his gaze slid back to her, and Alex noticed. It wasn't just a look, there was a connection there, something he couldn't place but felt in his gut. "Mom, sit down already," Alex said, his voice harsher than he intended. "You're on edge." Karen froze, then nodded, sitting down at the table. "Just a lot to do," she said, her voice barely audible. She looked at Alex, and there was a pleading look in her eyes, as if she was asking him not to dig any deeper. But Alex couldn't stop. He had to know. He remembered overhearing her call yesterday. She was talking to someone, asking him not to mention the club. He wasn't sure, but the voice on the other end sounded like Lisa, a colleague she sometimes mentioned. Was this the friend she was with at Pulse? He decided to check. "Mom, you came to see me a couple of weeks ago, right?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Were you hanging out with Lisa then? She works with you, I think." Karen tensed, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. "Yeah, I was with Lisa," she said, her voice too fast. I just stopped by the cafe. Nothing special." "Cafe?" Alex squinted. "Mark said he was at Pulse a couple of times. Weeks ago. You weren't there?" Mark choked on his coffee and coughed, and Karen turned pale. "No," she said, too quickly. I don't like clubs. You know that." "Yeah, I know," Alex said, but his voice was cold. He looked at her, then at Mark, and everything inside him screamed that they were lying. Both of them. He stood up, his chair creaking on the floor. "I'm going for a walk. Need some fresh air." "Alex," Karen reached out to him, but he was already heading for the door. "Are you coming back for dinner?" "I don't know," he said without turning around. He walked out onto the porch, his heart pounding. He couldn't sit with them any longer, pretending everything was okay. He had to decide what to do. Karen Harper stood at the living room window, clutching a mug of cold tea, watching the shadows from the chestnut tree creep across the lawn. The evening of the third day after Alex and Mark had arrived was falling over the suburbs, painting the sky a cold gray, but inside the house it was even colder. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, its pendulum swinging, a reminder of the inexorable passage of time. She could feel her secret, the one she had hidden for 2 weeks, tightening around her throat like a noose. Alex knew. She had seen it in his eyes at breakfast, in his sharp questions about Pulse and Lisa. Mark, the boy with his cheeky smile, had spilled the beans. And now everything she had spent years building, her family, her home, her role as a wife and mother, was coming apart at the seams. She set the mug on the windowsill, her hands shaking. She had overheard a snatch of Alex and Mark talking on the porch last night, not the words, but the tone, full of anger. Alex had come back into the house with a look of betrayal. She wanted to talk to him, to explain, but how? How could she tell her son that she, his mother, had given in to a moment of weakness because she felt invisible? She remembered that night at the Pulse, Lisa laughing and urging her toward the dance floor, Mark with his brazen confidence, and herself, Kay, who for one night had forgotten who she was. Now that night had been more than a mistake, it had been a disaster. The door to the living room swung open, and Karin jumped. Alex walked in, his green eyes bright like a man ready to fight. Mark followed behind him, his blonde hair disheveled and his face tense, but he held his head high, as if ready to defend himself. Karin felt her heart sink into her boots. "Mom, we need to talk," Alex said, his voice firm but trembling with suppressed anger. "Now." Karin swallowed, her fingers gripping the windowsill. "Alex, what happened?" she asked, even though she knew the answer. Her voice was thin, like a child caught in a lie. "Don't pretend." Alex stepped closer, his fists clenching. "Mark told me. About Pulse. About that night. About you." Karin felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Mark, who looked away, his cheeks flushed. "Alex, she began, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? That it was a mistake? That she didn't know he was her son's friend? "You slept with him." Alex pointed at Mark, his voice rising to a scream. "My best friend, Mom. How could you?" Karin opened her mouth, but her throat tightened. She could see the pain in his eyes, and it was worse than any scream. "Alex, please," she whispered. "It's not what you think. I didn't know who he was." "You didn't know?" Alex laughed, but it was bitter. "You were at the club with my friend, and you didn't know. You think I'll believe that?" Mark stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Alex, I swear I didn't know she was your mom. She said her name was Kay. I thought she was just a woman at the club." "Shut up, Mark," Alex snapped, turning on him. "You didn't know? What were you doing hanging around motels with other women? Did you even think she might have a family?" Karin felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back. "Alex, it's my fault," she said, her voice shaking. "Don't blame Mark. I wasn't myself. Lisa, my coworker, dragged me to that club. I was drinking. I felt alone. It was a mistake, one night." "A mistake?" Alex looked at her as if he saw her for the first time. "You cheated on Dad, Mom. Do you even understand what this means? For him? For us?" Karin took a step toward him, her hands reaching out, but he stepped back. "Alex, I didn't want you to know. I tried to forget it all. It didn't mean anything." "It didn't mean anything," Alex was almost shouting, his voice echoing in the living room. "You ruined everything, you and him." He pointed a finger at Mark, who stood with his head down like a guilty schoolboy. "I didn't know," Mark repeated, his voice quieter but still hurt. "I swear, Alex, if I'd known, I never would have." "You would never?" Alex turned to him, his face red with anger. "You slept with my mother, Mark. You sat at our table, eating her food like nothing happened. How can you even look me in the eye?" Karin felt her knees buckle. She wanted to say something, to explain, but the words felt hollow. She remembered how David had brushed her off 2 weeks ago, how he had missed their anniversary, how invisible she had felt. But that didn't make it right. Nothing did. "Karin," David's voice, sharp and cold, made her freeze. He stood in the doorway of the living room, his tablet hanging in his hand, his face like stone. "What's all that screaming? What's going on?" Karin turned, her heart stopping. She hadn't heard him come in, but now he was here, and his eyes, usually tired, were blazing with something she hadn't seen in years. Anger. She opened her mouth, but no words would come. "Dad," Alex began, his voice hoarse. What did you say?" David stepped forward, his gaze darting from Alex to Karin to Mark. "What do you mean she cheated on me?" Karin felt the floor slipping out from under her feet. "David, please," she whispered, but he was already looking at her as if she were a stranger. "Is that true?" His voice was like a blow. "You slept with that boy?" He pointed at Mark, his hand shaking. Our son's friend? Corin stepped toward him, her tears finally breaking through. It was one night, David. A mistake. I was drunk. I felt invisible. You were never there, you. Don't you dare blame me, David barked, his face turning purple. I did everything for you. I worked so we could have this house, so Alex could go to school. And you thank me like this? You weren't with me, Corin screamed, her voice breaking. You put your work before me for years. I was alone, David. I just wanted to feel alive. David looked at her, his eyes full of pain, but he quickly looked away. I did everything for you, he repeated, quieter, almost a whisper. Everything. He turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing loudly down the hallway. The door slammed, and Karen felt her heart break. Alex looked at her, his face a mixture of anger and despair. Are you happy now? He said, his voice shaking. You ruined everything. He turned and went upstairs, leaving her with Mark. Karen looked at Mark, who stood with his head down. Go away, she said quietly. Please, just go away. Mark nodded without saying a word and headed for the door. Karen was alone in the living room, her tears dripping onto the floor. The clock ticked, its sound mocking her life that had just fallen apart. She walked over to the fireplace where a family photo sat her, David, Alex, smiling on the beach 3 years ago. The frame had fallen during an argument, the glass had cracked, and now their smiles seemed like a lie. She didn't know how to fix it, but she knew one thing. Her mistake had broken their family, and she didn't know how to pick up the pieces. David Harper sat at his desk in his office, surrounded by the building models and stacks of blueprints that seemed to be the only thing holding his world together. Outside, night had fallen over the city, the streetlights casting a cold glow across the empty parking lot, but inside the office it was stuffy despite the humming air conditioner. His desk clock, an old brass-faced one, ticked on the shelf, a faint echo of the grandfather clock at home, the one his parents had given him and Karen for their wedding. Now the sound was like a knife cutting into his thoughts, reminding him of what he had just lost. His family, his wife, his life all shattered in one night. He gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white and stared at the screen of his laptop, where the lines of a skyscraper project blurred before his eyes. He had left home 3 hours ago after hearing Karen say, "It was one night, David. A mistake." A mistake. She had slept with a boy, their son's friend, and she had called it a mistake. His chest tightened as if someone had tied a rope around it. He stood up and paced the office, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He didn't know where else to go. Home, their home, felt foreign now, infected with her betrayal. David paused at the window, looking at his reflection, his tired face, his dark hair streaked with gray, his eyes filled with a pain he didn't want to admit. He'd always thought of himself as a good husband. He'd worked late into the night so they could have this house, so Alex could go to med school, so Karen wouldn't have to worry about the bills. But her words echoed in his head. You were never there. I was alone. He gritted his teeth, feeling his anger mingle with something else, guilt. He remembered how, 2 years ago, she'd suggested they go away for a weekend, just the two of them, and he'd brushed it off, busy with another project. Or how, last year, he'd missed their anniversary on a business trip. He thought she'd understand. She always did. Or did she? He walked back to his desk, his hand reaching for the phone, but stopped. Call her? Say what? How could you? Or I'm sorry I wasn't there? He hated himself for this weakness, for the way that even now, after her betrayal, he felt like some of the blame was his. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of water and a pack of blood pressure pills the doctor had prescribed them a year ago when he'd started complaining of headaches. He swallowed one with water, ignoring the slight ache in his chest. Just stress, he told himself. Just anger. David sat up, trying to concentrate on the plans, but his mind kept going back to the living room, to Alex's screams, to Karen's tears. He could see her face, not the one from today, but the one from 20 years ago, when they were young, laughing at him like he was her world. Where had it gone? When had he stopped noticing her? He remembered her cooking dinner, trying so hard for Alex, for that boy, Mark, who, He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Mark was just a kid, almost their son's age. How could she? He stood up, walked to the safe in the corner of the office. It held their savings, not cash, of course, but access to an account he and Karin had been saving for the future. He punched in the code, his fingers shaking, and transferred most of it to his personal account. It was petty, he knew, but it was the only thing he could control. If she wanted freedom, let her try without his money. He closed the safe, feeling anger mingle with emptiness. It wouldn't bring his family back, but it was something. "You did everything for us, didn't you?" he muttered, repeating his words from the living room. He had said it then to defend himself, to prove he was innocent. But now, alone, he wasn't so sure. He remembered the way Karin had looked at him, her eyes full of tears but also defiance. "You were never there." Those words cut deeper than her betrayal. He returned to his desk, opened his laptop, trying to drown the pain in work. It always worked. The drawings, the numbers, the projects, they were predictable, unlike his family. But today, the lines on the screen seemed meaningless. He saw Karin's face, her shaking hands, her pleading. And Alex's boy, looking at him with such pain that David felt like a traitor, even though she had been the one to betray him. His phone vibrated, and he winced. A message from a client. "Where's the final project? Deadline tomorrow." David gritted his teeth, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He hadn't slept properly in a week, but this was his salvation now. He would work until he could drown out the noise in his head. He wouldn't let her betrayal ruin him. He wouldn't let her win. But the pain in his chest was back, sharp as a shot. He brushed it off as stress and swallowed another pill, even though he knew he shouldn't. He opened the drawer and pulled out an old photo of him, Karin and Alex on the beach, 3 years ago. They were laughing, hugging each other, the sun shining on their backs. He looked at her smile, so alive, and couldn't figure out where it had disappeared. He shoved the photo back, his hands shaking. He didn't want to think about her, but he couldn't stop. "Karen," he whispered, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. He wanted to hate her, but part of him still loved her. And that was the worst part. The clock on the shelf ticked, its sound an echo of the one back home, a reminder of the family he had lost. He didn't know if he would ever go home, but he knew he couldn't stay here, in this office where everything screamed his failure. He closed his laptop, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. He would work, he would fight, but not today. Today, he just wanted to forget. The campus coffee shop was a hive of activity, students chatting at tables, cups clinking, the smell of freshly brewed espresso mingling with the aroma of baked goods. Alex Harper sat by the window, watching people hurry down the sidewalk, scarves tucked into the October wind. His fingers curled around his paper latte, now cold, but he didn't take a sip. It was the fourth day since the dinner when his world had shattered like glass, and the argument in the living room last night, his mom's screams, his dad's anger, Mark's silence still echoed in his head. He'd come here to campus to escape home, but he couldn't escape his thoughts. His best friend was sleeping with his mother. His father was gone, and his mother was a stranger. The door to the coffee shop clinked, and Alex tensed when he saw Mark. He walked in, his blonde hair disheveled, his leather jacket rumpled, as if he hadn't slept either. Mark noticed him and nodded, but his usual cocky smile was missing. He looked lost. Alex gritted his teeth, feeling his anger flare up again. He hadn't wanted to meet, but Mark had texted that morning, begging to talk. "Just give me 5 minutes, dude," the message had said. Alex agreed, even though everything in him screamed that this was a mistake. Mark sat down opposite, placing his coffee on the table. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I know you don't want to see me." "You're right," Alex snapped, his green eyes boring into Mark. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't get up and leave right now." Mark swallowed, his fingers fiddling nervously with the rim of his glass. "Because I want to explain. I screwed up, Alex, but I didn't know she was your mom. I swear." Alex laughed, but it was bitter, like the coffee he never drank. "You didn't know? Seriously, Mark? You slept with a woman 20 years older than you and didn't even ask who she was? Did you even think with your head? Mark looked down, his cheeks flushed. It was the pulse man. There's noise, alcohol, everything's a blur. She was with some friend, Lisa, I think. Called herself Kay. I thought she was just, a woman looking to have fun. I didn't ask about her life. It was a one-night stand. One night, Alex repeated, his voice as cold as the wind outside. And you thought it was okay to come into my house, sit at my table after you. He trailed off, unable to finish. The image of his mother and Mark together was like a knife in his chest. He'd seen her yesterday, crying in the living room, her words, I felt invisible. But that didn't excuse her. Or Mark. I didn't know she was your mom, Mark said, his voice almost pleading. When I found out at dinner, I almost ran away. But you know me, I didn't want to ruin it. I thought we could just pretend it never happened. Pretend? Alex leaned forward, his fists clenched on the table. You slept with my mom, Mark. You destroyed my family. Dad left yesterday, did you see? He won't even look at her. And I don't know how to look at her now. Or you. Mark hung his head, his fingers clenching the glass so tightly that the paper crumpled. I know I screwed up, but I didn't mean to. I thought it was just the night. She left this morning, leaving a note for me to keep quiet. I kept quiet until you started digging. Alex remembered the napkin, her words, this is a mistake. Shut up. He'd seen it in Mark's hands on the porch, and it had only made him more angry. But now he was thinking about something else, the phone his mother had hidden. He'd come home from coffee the night before, waited for her to shower, and taken it from the towel drawer. The screen was password protected, but he'd opened the messages anyway. There were only two, hers, shut up, please, and Mark's reply, I'm here if you want me to. It was a punch to the gut. She hadn't just made a mistake. She'd kept his words like a trophy. I saw her phone, Alex said, his voice low, almost menacing. Your message. I'm here if you want me. Did you really think she'd text you? Will this continue? Mark's head snapped up, his eyes wide. No, dude, it's not like that. I don't know why I wrote that. It was stupid. I wasn't going to follow through. I just wanted her to know that I wouldn't rat her out. Don't, Alex almost shouted, and a couple of students at the next table turned around. He lowered his voice, but the anger was still there. You already did, Mark. You told me, and now I have to live with it. I have to look at her knowing that he trailed off, his throat tightening. Mark leaned closer, his voice quiet but sincere. Alex, I'm your friend. I know it sounds like shit right now, but I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know who she was, and I hate myself for it. Alex looked at him, trying to find a lie in his face, but he saw only guilt. Mark, who had always been the life of the party, who laughed at everything, now looked broken. But that didn't take away the pain. You're not my friend anymore, Alex said, his voice cold as glass. You're selfish, Mark. You've always been like that. You only think about yourself, your parties, your nights out. And now, because of you, my family is falling apart. Mark opened his mouth, but found no words. He nodded, as if accepting the sentence, and stood up. I understand, he said quietly. I'm leaving, but if you want to talk, I'm here. I don't want to, Alex snapped, looking out the window so as not to see Mark leave. The coffee shop door clinked, and he was left alone, clutching a cold glass. He felt as if he had lost not only a friend, but a part of himself. The dim light from his desk lamp flooded David's office, casting long shadows from the model buildings that loomed on his desk like the ruins of unfulfilled ambition. Outside, the night had deepened, and the parking lot below was empty, except for a single street lamp that flickered, as if to wink at his loneliness. The clock, an old brass-faced one, ticked on the shelf, its rhythm a faint echo of the grandfather clock at home, the one his parents had given him and Karin for their wedding. Now the sound was a reminder of what he had lost. David sat hunched over a piece of paper, the pen shaking in his hand as he tried to find the words to express his pain, his anger, his guilt. He was writing a letter to Corin, but every word felt wrong, as if he were trying to build a bridge across a chasm he had helped create. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples where they throbbed. It had been a day since the argument in the living room, when he had heard her confess, "It was a one-night stand, David, a mistake." He had left, slamming the door, and was now sleeping in the office, on a fold-out couch that smelled of dust and coffee. He couldn't go home, couldn't look at her, couldn't see Alex with her eyes full of pain, as if he, David, had failed him as much as Corin. He gritted his teeth, feeling the anger flare up again, but the guilt followed, sticky and heavy. She had said, "You were never there," and he knew it was true. David looked at the paper in front of him. "Karen," he wrote, and then nothing. What could he say? "How could you?" Or, "I'm sorry I left you alone." He remembered her face yesterday, the tears, the shaking hands, her voice full of despair. "I felt invisible." He wanted to hate her for cheating on him, for sleeping with a boy, their son's friend, but part of him couldn't. He saw her loneliness, saw the ways she tried to reach out to him, the dinners he canceled, the weekends he spent at the office, their anniversary he missed for a business trip. He thought she would understand. She always understood. But now he saw that it was his mistake. He picked up a pen and began to write, but the words came out as sloppy as his blueprints as an intern. "Corin, I saw your pain. I knew you were alone, but I turned away. I thought this job was for us, for Alex, but I was wrong. I wasn't there for you. But you chose to betray me." He stopped, reread, and his face twisted. It was too much. Too honest, too weak. He couldn't afford to be weak. He crumpled the paper, threw it in the trash, but missed, and the paper fell to the floor, further proof of his failure. The pain in his chest was back, sharp as a sting. He rubbed it, chalking it up to stress, and reached for the drawer where his blood pressure pills were. His doctor had warned him a year ago. Less stress, more rest. But rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not with his clients breathing down his neck and his family falling apart. He swallowed the pill, washed it down with a bottle of water, and tried to focus on the project. The blueprints for the skyscraper lay before him, the lines clear but meaningless. He had always found solace in his work, but today it felt empty. "Shit," he muttered, leaning back. His gaze fell on the framed photograph on the table him, Corin and Alex on the beach, 3 years ago. They were laughing, their arms around each other, the sun at their backs. He picked up the frame, his fingers shaking. Corin had looked so alive in the picture, her eyes shining like they had when they were first married. Where had she gotten lost? He remembered her making dinner for Alex, and that boy, Mark, trying so hard to make everything perfect. And he hadn't even noticed. He'd been too busy to notice. His phone vibrated, and he winced. A message from a client, "Where's the final project? Deadline in the morning." David gritted his teeth, his fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up blueprints. He would work. He always worked. But the pain in his chest intensified, and he felt sweat break out on his forehead. He brushed it off as fatigue and began to edit the lines, but his hands were shaking. He remembered Karen's voice, her cry yesterday, "I was alone, David." He had seen her tears, her despair, and it cut deeper than her betrayal. He knew she was alone, knew she was trying to reach out to him. But he had turned away, buried in his projects, thinking he was providing for his family. He had been a good husband, he told himself. But had he? He remembered the way Alex had looked at him yesterday, his eyes full of pain, as if he blamed him as well as Karen. And that was the worst of it. David picked up a new sheet of paper and began writing again. "Karen, I don't know how we got to this point. I saw your pain, but I thought you could handle it. I was wrong. I wasn't there for you, and you chose him. I don't know how to forgive, but I don't want to lose us." He stopped, his hand shaking. He couldn't send it. Not now. He crumpled the paper, but instead of throwing it away, he stuffed it into his jacket pocket, as if it could contain his feelings. The pain in his chest grew sharper, and he winced, rubbing it. "Just stress," he muttered, but his voice was weak. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty parking lot. He wanted to go home, to see Karen, to see Alex, but he didn't know how. He didn't know how to look her in the eyes, knowing she was with someone else. And yet he couldn't stop thinking about her smile, about the way she'd held his hand on that beach. He walked back to the table, his gaze falling on the clock. Its ticking was an echo of the house he had left behind. He remembered how much Karen had loved that clock, how she had cleaned it every spring, how she had said it was the heart of their family. Now that heart seemed to have stopped. He picked up his keys, deciding he would go home. Not now, not tonight, but soon. He had to see her, talk to her, even if it broke him. But the pain in his chest hit again, harder, and he clutched the table to steady himself. He knew it was more than just stress, but he didn't want to admit it. He couldn't be weak. Not now. The morning light in David's office was gray, as if the sun had decided not to expend any energy on the day. He sat on the fold-out couch that had become his bed for the past 2 days, his shirt wrinkled and his face drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. Blueprints were piled high on his desk, his laptop blinking with client notifications, but David wasn't looking at the screen. His gaze was fixed on the crumpled piece of paper in his hand, the letter he'd written to Karen the night before and kept. I saw your pain, but I thought you could handle it. The words burned like hot metal, a reminder of his own guilt, now mingled with her betrayal. The clock on his desk ticked, a faint echo of the grandfather clock at home, each tick a blow to his nerves. The pain in his chest that had started yesterday was back, sharp and insistent. He rubbed it, chalking it up to lack of sleep and stress, but his hand shook as he reached for his bottle of water. His blood pressure pills were in the drawer, but he hadn't grabbed another. The doctor had warned him that more than 2 a day was dangerous. He stood up, shaking himself, and paced the length of his office, his steps heavy as if the floor were made of sand. He hadn't slept well since the argument in the living room when Karen had confessed her mistake, sleeping with Mark, their son's friend. Her words, her tears, Alex's anger, they all played in his head like a broken record. He'd left with his savings in a fit of anger, but now, alone, he felt like it hadn't solved anything. He paused at the window, looking out at the parking lot where his car sat alone, covered in morning dew. He wanted to go home, to see Karen, to see Alex, but every time he pictured her face, he saw her with that boy. Mark, with his cocky grin, with his youth, said that David had lost somewhere between blueprints and deadlines. He clenched his fists, feeling the anger flare up again, but guilt followed like a shadow. Karen had screamed, "You were never there," and he knew it was true. He remembered how she had tried to organize dinner 2 weeks ago, how she had wanted to get the spark back, and he had waved her off, burying his nose in the project. He thought she could handle it. She always did. His phone vibrated, and he winced, hoping it was Karen. But it was the client again. "Where are the plans? I'll wait until 10 a.m. David cursed under his breath and went back to his desk, but his fingers froze over the keyboard. He couldn't work. Not today. The pain in his chest intensified, and he winced, rubbing it. "Just stress," he muttered, but his voice was weak, as if he were trying to convince someone other than himself. He picked up the letter, smoothed it out on the table. "I don't know how to forgive, but I don't want to lose us." He'd written it that night in a fit of rage, but now the words seemed empty. Forgive? How could he forgive her for sleeping with a boy almost their son's age? But losing her, losing their family, was even worse. He remembered Alex, his angry eyes, his cry, "You ruined everything." David knew some of that anger was directed at him too. He wasn't home, a father, a husband. He has blueprints, projects, deadlines. The pain hit again, sharp as a knife, and he clutched his chest, his breathing coming in heavy gasps. He leaned against the table, trying to breathe, but the air felt thick as water. "Fuck," he croaked, his knees buckling. He collapsed to the floor, papers and pens spilling over the edge of the table. His hand reached for the phone, but his fingers wouldn't obey. He watched the screen go blank, the clock ticking, its sound the only thing that connected him to reality. Karen sat in the kitchen, her fingers wrapped around her empty mug, her eyes glued to her phone, not the other one she'd been hiding, but the main one which held no messages from David. She hadn't slept all night, her thoughts swirling around the fight, around Alex's tears, his anger, his departure. She knew he'd met Mark that day, and she was afraid he'd come back with even more anger. The clock in the living room ticked, its sound mocking her efforts to hold her family together. She remembered Lisa dragging her into Pulse, how she'd given in by calling herself Kay, how she'd allowed herself one night of weakness. Now that night was like poison, poisoning everything she loved. Her phone rang, and she jumped when she saw the hospital number. "Hello?" Her voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. "Mrs. Harper." The voice on the other end was businesslike, but with a note of alarm. "This is Dr. Lewis from the city hospital. Your husband, David Harper, has been admitted with a heart attack. You need to come." Karen felt her heart stop. "What?" she whispered, her hand gripping the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Heart attack? Is he okay?" "He's stable, but you'd better come," the doctor replied. "We're doing everything we can." She dropped the phone, grabbed her keys, and ran out of the house without a thought for her coat or bag. At the hospital, she burst into the waiting room, her hair disheveled and her face pale as a ghost. "David Harper," she breathed to the nurse at the desk. "Where is he?" The nurse looked at her, her gaze cold. "Are you a relative?" "I'm his wife," Karen almost screamed. "Let me go to him." "Just immediate family," the nurse said, checking the papers. "Sorry, but you can't come in yet. He's in intensive care." Karen felt her knees buckle. She leaned against the counter, her tears dripping onto the marble floor. "Please," she whispered, "this is my husband. I have to see him." The nurse shook her head. "Wait here. I'll let you know when it's okay." Karen slumped into a chair in the waiting room, her hands shaking. She remembered Lisa, her laugh at the Pulse, her words, "Get your sparkle back." She remembered Mark, his smile, his hands, and how she'd let herself forget who she was. Now David was in the hospital, and she couldn't even see him. She blamed herself, blamed Lisa, blamed everything that had led to this night. The clock on the wall ticked, but at home, she knew, theirs had stopped, as if time itself had abandoned their family. Alex walked into the hospital an hour later, his face pale, his eyes red. He saw Karen sitting in the corner and stopped. "Mom," he said, his voice was hoarse. "What's wrong with him?" "Heart attack," she whispered, not looking at him. He's in intensive care." Alex sat down next to her, but he didn't touch her. He'd visited David when he'd been moved to the ward and heard him quietly confess, "I wasn't there for her, Alex. I let her down." The words stung because they were true. But Karen, sitting in front of him, was the one who'd destroyed their family. He didn't know how to forgive her, but as he watched her cry, he felt he couldn't hate her. The clock in the hospital ticked, its sound as cold as the sterile walls. Karen and Alex sat in silence, separated by pain but connected by it. Their family was on the brink, and they didn't know how to save it. Rain slapped against the windshield of Karen's car, streaming down in rivulets that distorted the dim light of the streetlights. Alex sat in the passenger seat, his fingers clutching the seatbelt as if it would keep him from the chaos raging inside. It was late morning, the 5th day since Mark had confessed his mistake on the porch, and the 3rd since the fight that had torn their family apart. Dad was in the hospital, stable but weak, and Mom, behind the wheel, looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, her eyes were red from crying, and she said nothing as the car sat in the hospital parking lot, the rain pounding the roof, drowning out the ticking of the clock that still echoed in Alex's head. He insisted on this conversation. After yesterday at the hospital, when he'd seen her cowering in the waiting room and heard his dad's quiet confession, "I failed her, Alex." He knew he couldn't run from the truth any longer. He had to talk to her, even if it meant breaking him. He'd stared at her profile, trying to find the mom who baked him cookies, read him fairy tales, but all he saw was the woman who hid her phone, lied to him, slept with his best friend, and yet he couldn't hate her. Not completely. "Mom," he began, his voice hoarse, almost muffled by the rain. "We need to talk. About everything." Karin gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze fixed on the raindrops on the glass. "Alex, I don't know where to start," she whispered. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be." "Angry?" Alex laughed, but the laughter was bitter, like the rain outside the window. "Mom, you slept with Mark. With my friend. Do you even understand how does that sound? How am I supposed to look at you now? At him?" Karin closed her eyes, her breathing ragged. "I know," she said, her voice shaking. "I know I ruined everything. But Alex, it wasn't. I didn't mean for it to happen this way." "You didn't want to?" Alex turned to her, his green eyes blazing. "Then why? Why did you go to that damn club? Why did you call yourself Kay? Why didn't you tell him who you were?" Karin finally looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "Because I was alone, Alex," she said, her voice breaking. "I was invisible. Your father, he hadn't seen me in years. He'd come home with his nose in his drawings, and I was just part of the house, like furniture. I wanted to feel alive, even if just for one night." Alex gritted his teeth, his fingers digging into his belt. He remembered his dad's words in the hospital. "I wasn't there." He knew it was true, but it didn't make the pain go away. "And you chose Mark? My friend? Did you even think about what that would do to us?" "I didn't know who he was." Karin shook her head, tears dripping onto the steering wheel. "Lisa, my co-worker, dragged me to Pulse. She said I needed to shake things up. I was drinking and dancing, and he was there. He didn't know I was married, that I had a son. I called myself Kay because I wanted to be someone else that night. Not Mrs. Harper, not your mother, just a woman." Alex looked at her, his anger warring with pity. He saw her pain, her loneliness, and it cut him because he knew Dad was part of it. But she had made a choice. "You saved his message," he said, his voice cold. "I saw the phone. You asked him to keep quiet, and he wrote, 'I'm here if you want me.' Why didn't you delete it?" Karen flinched, her face going pale. You looked at my phone," she whispered, her voice full of horror. "Yes." Alex didn't look away. "I found it in the drawer. You were hiding it like it was evidence. Why didn't you delete his message, Mom? Did you want to keep going?" "No," Karen almost screamed, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly it creaked. "No, Alex, I didn't mean to. I don't know why I didn't delete it. Maybe because that night was the only time I felt alive. I hate myself for it, but I couldn't erase it. It was like proof that I could still be desirable." Alex turned away, looking out the window at the rain blurring the world. He wanted to scream, to blame her, but her words, her loneliness, her pain were too familiar. He remembered Dad skipping their dinners, Mom sitting alone in the living room, looking at old photos. He'd seen it, but he never thought it would come to this. "You ruined us," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Dad's in the hospital, Mom. He could have died. And all because of you." Corin sniffled, her tears flowing freely. "I know," she whispered. "I know it's my fault. But I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I love your father, Alex. I love you. I'm just lost." Alex looked at her, his heart clenching. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. She was his mother, the one who had always been there for him, even when he didn't deserve it. He remembered her sitting in the hospital, not allowed to see his dad, her tears, her despair. And his dad's words, "I failed her." They were both at fault, and that made it even harder. "I didn't show Dad your message," he said, his voice even but shaking inside. "I could have, but I didn't. Because, because I don't want him to hate you. But I don't know how to trust you now." Karin looked at him, her eyes full of pain and hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve this, but I'll do anything to make it right, Alex. I promise." "Not both goodbye," he said, his voice cold. "Just be honest. With him. With yourself. I don't know what's next, but I don't want any more lies." She nodded, her tears dripping onto the steering wheel. "I'll try," she said quietly. "I'll try." The rain continued to pound, muffling everything but their breathing. Alex looked out the window, feeling his anger recede, leaving behind fatigue. Karen Harper sat on the living room couch, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sweater, as the gray morning of the sixth day after the dinner that had changed everything blended with the patter of rain that hadn't stopped since yesterday. The grandfather clock in the corner was silent, its pendulum frozen, as if time itself had refused to move forward since the argument that had torn their family apart. The cracked family photo on the mantelpiece herself, David, Alex on the beach 3 years ago, was slightly askew, its broken glass reflecting the dim light of the lamp. Karen looked at it, feeling her heart squeeze. She had ruined it, their laughter, their togetherness in one week night at the Pulse, giving in to Lisa and her sadness. Now David was in the hospital, Alex was barely speaking to her, and Mark, the boy, was a shadow that had shattered her world. The door opened, and Karin jumped. Alex walked in, his dark hair wet from the rain, his green eyes tired but determined. Behind him came David, his steps slow, almost hesitant, as if he were still adjusting to his body after a heart attack. His face was pale, but his eyes, usually cold from work, were softer, full of something Karin couldn't name. She stood, her hands shaking. "Alex, David," she said, her voice hoarse. You're here." Alex nodded, his gaze hard. "I told Dad we needed to talk. Everyone. No lies." He looked at her, a mixture of pain and hope in his eyes. "Are you ready?" Karin swallowed, her throat dry. She knew this conversation was inevitable after yesterday, when she and Alex had talked in the car, when he'd shown her that he'd seen her text to Mark but hadn't told David. She nodded, her fingers tightening on her sweater. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm ready." They sat at the dining room table, the same one where it had all started 6 days ago. The stain from Mark's spilled wine still lay on the tablecloth like a scar. David sat across from Karin, his hands on the table but not looking at her. Alex sat between them, like a mediator, his face tense but determined. "I want us to be honest," Alex said, his voice even but steely. "Dad, you know what Mom did. I know. But I also know you weren't with her. Not really. And I'm tired of coming between you." Karen felt the tears sting her eyes, but she held them back. She looked at David, his face a mask, but there was a flicker of pain in his eyes. "David," she began, her voice shaking. I don't know how to begin. It's my fault. That night at the club with Mark, it was my mistake. I was lonely, I felt invisible. Lisa, my coworker, dragged me there, and I gave in. I didn't know he was Alex's friend, but that's no excuse. I ruined us." David finally looked at her, his eyes full of pain, but he wasn't screaming like he had in the living room. "You think I don't know I've been a bad husband?" he said, his voice low, almost hoarse. "I saw you pull away, Karin. I saw you try to reach out the dinners, the conversations, that stupid vacation you suggested. I thought work was more important. I thought I was doing this for us. But I left you alone. And now you've chosen him." Karin shook her head, her tears flowing freely. "It wasn't a choice, David. It was a weakness. I hate myself for it. But I love you. I always have." Alex looked at them, his fists clenched on the table. "You're both guilty," he said, his voice firm but shaking. "Mom, you did this. You slept with my friend, and I don't know how to forget it. And you, Dad, you abandoned her. You abandoned us, buried in your blueprints. I don't want to choose between you, but I can't live with this lie." David hung his head, his fingers tightening on the edge of the table. "I know, son," he said quietly. "I failed you both. In the hospital, I thought I was going to die, and all I could think about was you. Karin, I don't know how to forgive you, but I don't want to lose us. I don't want to lose you." Karin whimpered, her hand reaching out for him, then stopping. "I don't want to either," she whispered, "but I don't know how to fix it. I signed up for classes. I want to. I want to find myself, not just be your wife or Alex's mom, but I want us to try. At least for a while, not the end. David nodded, his eyes hard, but with a glimmer of hope. Pause, he said. I'll leave you a message if I'm ready to talk, but not now. I need time. Alex looked at them, his heart clenching. He didn't know if their marriage would survive, but he could see their pain, their desire to hold on. I don't know how to forgive either, he said quietly, but I don't want to lose you, either of you. Karen looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, Alex, she whispered. I'll do anything to earn your trust back. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.